Okay, we're back. And we've got a panel, just like that. We're going to just quickly start this session with a couple of giveaways. Each day we'll be giving away some things that are associated with our guest speakers. We've got a copy of The Other End of the Leash by Dr. Patricia McConnell. And we've had to come up with, really objective and practical and quick ways to give these away. So, who travelled for more than 10 hours to get here today?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. Okay, who travelled for more than 15 hours to get here today? Who travelled for more than 20 hours to get here today? Are they narrowing down? More than 25? Anyone more than 30 hours to get here today?
Australia. Okay.
Anyone more than 35 hours?
So, come down.
You're the winner. And Dr. McConnell will personalise this for you later on.
Well, thank you very much. 55 hours. Oh my God. I'm going to fire my travel.
55 hours, wow. At least you've got some reading for the return leg. Yes. Now, who travelled less than an hour to get here today? Anyone less than half an hour? Less than 20 minutes? Less than 15? Less than 10? Less than 5? Less than 3? 2? Okay, you got it. You get one of our lovely Do You Believe in Dog t-shirts that were designed by James Hudson for this event. Oh, actually not a t-shirt, it's a tote bag. I got excited. And speaking of distances travelled, Julie.
We had some nice notification from Prescott Breeden, the organizer of SPARCS, that some people are here from Israel, and they were particularly excited to get to take in this conference live. They were talking about the changing tides of different training techniques, and they were very excited to hear this information and ultimately bring it back with them to their country. So just to share, as we get in some nice, interesting stories about the effects of this conference on people and how people are very excited to be here. So we wanted to say thank you for sharing your story with us. Great. So we are going to be starting our panel today, and just very briefly, if we could just go down the panel and just do a little wave and say your name, because some people are just waking up in different parts of the world, and we want them to know who you are. So just down the line, like you would in school.
I'm Ray Coppinger.
I'm Monique Udell. Patricia McConnell. Kathryn Lord.
Mia Cobb.
Julie Hecht.
Clive Wynne.
Simon Gadbois.
James Serpell.
Excellent. So for the viewers at home, this is who you'll be hearing from for the next 45 minutes. And obviously, our topic today is this incredibly large topic called aggression and conflict, as it's been labeled. And we're going to have to start with this topic that came up earlier in the day, the C word now. We could say consciousness. And we just kind of wanted to begin there because it's...
We're jumping right in.
We're jumping in. And we just wanted to open it up to the panel and say, go for it. We have a lot of questions from the online and the in-studio audience, but anybody have any thoughts on consciousness that they want to just jump in with? Go.
Funny how everyone's looking at me. And that
for those of you who actually weren't here, the gauntlet was thrown down by Dr. Coppinger. You should probably say what you said this morning first. You should probably repeat what you said about consciousness, because it's a great start to a conversation.
All right. I use that quite often, to say that dogs aren't conscious, because it wakes up the audience, and they sit there and they fight me on it. But actually, it does come down to the fact is that you have these motor patterns, which are taxonomic characters of the animal, of the species, if you will, and it's inherited. And if I wanted a border collie, if I wanted to herd sheep, I'd get myself a border collie. And the reason being is that they have those innate motor patterns, and you can't teach a dog to do that. You put them in the right environment, and then they go into this eye-stalk behavior. It's everybody who's ever worked with border collies knows that it's genetic. And so if it is genetic, what makes you think the dog even knows what he's doing? All right? In other words, I breathe here, and in and out, and all day long, and I never think about it. I don't know that I'm doing it. I'm not conscious that I'm doing it. And I thought my little story about driving to work and not knowing what route I took is, a kind of unconsciousness. So that's what I was getting at, because when Patricia was talking and she was showing the pictures of those really, really nice border collies, and they're doing their little thing, and you say, well, it's a aggression on the part of the sheep, and the dog knows and backs off. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that what happens is that the dog's in an environment, and that environment changes, and so it withdraws. At that time, it withdraws the motor pattern, and I just didn't think they were necessarily conscious of that the sheep was threatening them or anything like that. So anyway, I threw down the gauntlet. You were right.
Sure, yeah, he does that.
And there was someone who suggested we scrap the panel and just put you two in a cage and let you fight it out. But we're all grown up, so Tricia.
Well, and there are there are some great minds on this panel who I'm sure also have some other things to say about it. But just to start, first of all, Ray is absolutely right that a tremendous amount of behavior could be done without consciousness. People who have sleep disorders actually have, there's a famous case in which someone actually murdered his in-laws. He had a sleep disorder, and he was sound asleep. He was literally sleepwalking, but in this case, he was sleep murdering. But one of the things we know about sleep is that your brain is still very, very busy, but while you're normally asleep, if you're a normal person, then your body's actually paralyzed. So you can't actually act out these things. And so this person was charged with murder and then judged innocent, because the neurologist convinced the jury and the judge that he had literally no consciousness of what he was doing. So it's absolutely true that a tremendous amount of behavior can occur without consciousness. But he's wrong. and bless him. Although I don't know that either. We're all just making this up. I don't know that dogs are conscious. Here's what I do know. One of the leading researchers on consciousness is Tononi. He's a brilliant neurophysiologist who works at my university, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's been studying consciousness for decades. And what he's done is, first of all, to try and figure out what it is in people. I mean, how do you know that I'm conscious, right? How do you know that how do we know that anybody is conscious? How do you prove that? So what he's done is he's done decades of really good neurobiology looking at people in different states of what we would call consciousness. So people who are awake, people who are in vegetative brain states, people who've been anesthetized for surgery. And here's probably the key to what he's found. What he's found is that we know that when you're asleep, all of the areas of your brain are still active. Your brain does not go to sleep. All of the areas of your brain are still active. I'm speaking somewhat simplistically, but needless to say, all your brain is busy. What's different about being asleep is that the different areas of your brain do not connect. There is no discussion, no interaction, very little communication between different areas of your brain. That's cut off. So every area of your brain is acting independently. And as you look at different states of what we understand to be human consciousness, you see less and less connections and interplay between the different parts of the brain. I asked Tononi at one of his talks, I said, do you think dogs are conscious? Because this is a huge argument among philosophers, among animal rights activists. This is a very important question. It gets back to Descartes, who basically argued that animals were just like machines. And it's still being debated. And so I asked Tononi, do you think that dogs are conscious? And he said, yeah. Yeah, I do. And basically he said, and I think somebody else suggested this, is it doesn't have to be a yes or no continuum, just like cognition is not a yes or no continuum. He said, and we can look, we can look and see. He said, but there's every indication that along the continuum, dogs are more conscious than many other animals and probably closer to us than they are to other animals. So that's my contribution. I'd be curious about anybody else who wants to jump in and add to the
might take the discussion over to James, if we may, James. I think
That
there
was a-
might have been a mention earlier about perhaps some things are conscious and some things may not be.
Yeah. I mean, I think also we have to sort of distinguish between consciousness and self-consciousness, self-awareness, and there isn't much evidence that dogs have that. So there's not much evidence that dogs reflect on themselves or have an awareness of themselves as a kind of separate being and with a continuity across their lifespans or thoughts of the future. But I mean, the evidence I would say, even from humans, is that people bring consciousness into play when they're dealing with complex problems. That's where we really use it, because you can't automate that stuff. It has to be conscious. It has to be thought through. And it's quite clear to me that dogs can do that. They can plan, they can strategize, they can solve complex problems. Not all dogs. My dog can't solve any problems at all. But other dogs can, and I don't see how they can do that without some level of consciousness, because they have to sift through a lot of information, weigh it, and decide on different strategies. And I think you need some level of consciousness for that. I mean, I do an awful lot of stuff automatically. I'm on autopilot a lot of the time. Afterwards I only think, I'm conscious. And people have done experiments where, it turns out if you look at people's brain patterns, people have actually made their decisions before they're conscious they've made them. So it's the knowledge of one's consciousness is kind of retrospective. It happens so quickly that we don't notice it, we don't process things that quickly. But it turns out that we're probably making a lot of unconscious decisions and then thinking we were conscious of the choice because it happened so fast. And so I think, consciousness is confusing, but really I think you have to look at it as a kind of continuum. Some things it's more economical and makes more sense to do automatically without thinking. And other things, complex problems that you need to solve in your life, you've got to bring consciousness to bear on those problems.
Yes.
So, I mean, it often feels like consciousness is primarily when we're solving complex problems, but actually you can be conscious of just the intriguing blue on the wall over there from the light that's down beneath. Consciousness is for somebody who has himself perhaps spent too much time writing about animal consciousness, I do feel that especially in a context like this where we have an A for applied in the title of our gathering, it doesn't ultimately make any difference. It's going to be something that we could argue about indefinitely, precisely because I haven't been able to come up with any specific piece of evidence that could prove to you that a dog or other non-human is conscious or not. And even in our own species, there's plenty of room in special cases of, there's the intriguing distinction between I mean, apart from just those colleagues who really never seem to be there, there's the intriguing distinction between people who are in a coma, where they're not conscious, and people in this locked-in state, where they appear like they're in a coma, but actually, if they ever recover, they'll tell you afterwards that they knew everything that was going on the whole time and they were thinking thoughts. But I think without wanting to capture the conversation, I think the important issue is the welfare question, and that's there's the notion of animal welfare and the notion of human welfare, and that ultimately is what it's why it's worth spending time talking about dogs and worrying about dogs and trying to understand dogs better, is because they occupy this immense role in human affairs. That there are 84 million dogs in people's homes in the United States, and from time to time they do horrible things, biting children's faces off or whatever, and a lot of the time they're doing wonderful things, and what really matters is how to maximize the benefits to both species that have somehow ended up in this situation.
Okay. Oh, right here. Yep.
I can pass the baton.
See, I think there's one additional point, Clive, is that, yeah, we could wrestle around with consciousness and from a philosophical point or from a scientific point of view. I think that the reason I brought it up in the first place was to get people to change their vocabulary when they're talking dogs. You yourself have written papers on why anthropomorphism isn't the right solution to even asking these questions. So they've asked me to come down here to be a scientist. And then I sit here as a scientist and I talk to people in the audience, and they use all those words informally. The dog is very intelligent. There's books out there that list dogs according to their intelligence and so on. And it's foolishness. It's just foolishness. And so if you change the vocabulary, I'd be happy to accept the fact that maybe they're conscious sometimes.
So, okay, we're gonna, Simone, can we go to you as well? Did you want to add to this?
Well, although after what Ray says, yeah, maybe. So, I think
Yeah, maybe.
from a neuroscience perspective, this is a trendy topic right now, consciousness and neuroscience. And I think we also have to be careful in distinguishing between consciousness and cognition. And that was not always clear, even with the early ethologists that got interested in cognition. They often confused, I think, this idea of consciousness and cognition, trying to demonstrate consciousness, with cognitive abilities. And we know in philosophy and psychology that makes no sense. But there are cognitive processes that are implicit, we call it. In neuroscience, it's well known. And others that are explicit. In other words, there are things, it's very well known, that the brain will do without really our awareness of it. But that's different from, I think, what we're talking about here is more like social cognitive kind of stuff. And the Europeans are very big into this thing about, for instance, theory of mind and all that. And I'm maybe more North American in the sense that I tend to go with the parsimony principle. You don't need to go that far in explanations that are difficult to test if you can come up with simpler explanations. And I'm not yet convinced that we need to go and talk about very deep, social cognitive processes in dogs. Now, not to minimize the fact that I think they're really amazing in terms of their ability to process, social information. I'm just saying that, as I argued earlier today, that there are things already in place there to do this without them having to, worry too much about it. As in humans, by the way. And again, that's how the brain works. There's a lot of things you do every day that you're not really aware of, really, but you do them. And there's a huge literature in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience on this. Very interesting.
So to bring it a little bit into the application, as Clive was saying, and as we're saying, well, so what about it? Barking is something where, does it matter if it's conscious or not? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I think it does, and I think it plays out a lot. What you guys were saying is that the natural assumption for a lot of people who aren't scientists is to think that dogs are doing what we're doing, the anthropomorphism sort of angle. And so when dogs bark, people tend to immediately think it's like our kind of communication, where the dog is telling you about a stranger because they understand that there's a stranger out there, and they understand that you understand that they're telling you about a stranger. So they're all aware of all of this interaction. And the data suggests that you can explain it without any of that happening, where the dog, it's more like when you stub your toe and you say ouch, which I think was an example from before, where you're not consciously trying to communicate any kind of information. It just comes out because it hurt, and someone could gather information from that, not very specific information, but something. Whereas if you said, I just stubbed my toe and it hurt, you just, consciously told someone something about the situation. And so starting from a point of assumption that there is this higher level of, whether it be consciousness or even you could go into cognition, is a dangerous place to start with our applied interactions with our dogs. We could really miscommunicate a lot if we assume that they're at our level.
So the good news is this conversation is not going away anytime soon, so we can come back to it with all of our panelists. But we did want to jump in kind of actually from the applied angle of this aggression and conflict question. If we want to not make it about definitions or terms and take it back to behavior, we have a lot of great questions about behavior from the audience. So this one was for Patricia. Sally from the UK said, I have not heard the term of V and C mouth open positions. Please, can you expand on this?
Oh, sure. It's just a description. It's just basically a simple description of the commissure, which is the corners of a dog's mouth. And if the dog is doing a sort of classic agonistic pucker, in which the commissure is moved forward, and very often it'll raise the lips and do a tooth display. This is something that we don't do as humans, although I've mentioned in seminars before that I did once, and it's very, very effective.
Julie's trying to demonstrate. She looks like she's doing a really bad duck face.
Scares the hell out of a selected party if you need it, because they don't expect it. But that is not something we normally do. But so the C, basically, if you look at so many images of dogs in agonistic encounters, what you'll see is the commissure forward, and it forms sort of a C. If the dog, on the other hand, is what a lot of people believe to be in a kind of a defensive posture, possibly a fearful posture, you see the commissure pulled backwards, and you get like this V effect. So the commissure is pulled towards the back of the head, and it looks more like a V. That's associated with sort of ethologically, it's been called a fear gape. I think you mentioned that, one of my colleagues mentioned that today, so it's often called the fear gape. And it's quite universal among quite a few mammals, but anyway, so that's what the V and the C is about.
We'll ask one other quick question, then we'll move on to another juicier topic. A question for Ray. Where does play fall into the 3 categories of measurable motor patterns? So in terms of foraging or reproductive or hazard avoidance, where do you see play?
I don't know what to say. It's a long subject to introduce an audience to something as complicated as play. Well, what we know about play is that it's more common in young animals than it is in old animals. And Kathryn's done a whole bunch of studies on differences in development between dogs and breeds thereof, or wolves and breeds thereof. And what she found in those studies is that as the animal converts from being a neonate to being an adult, it has to get rid of all those neonatal motor patterns, all those sucking motor patterns, all those little alarm calls and so on that are very specific to the age of the neonate. And so as they drop out of the system, as the neonatal motor patterns drop out of the system and the adult motor patterns begin to turn on, the animal's in an interesting mixture where they're providing, they're playing, I can't do it, they are performing motor patterns from the neonatal period and the adult period. They're also displaying motor patterns out of sequence. In other words, instead of being a foraging motor pattern, all of a sudden it could be in another system. And so when we see that, we say, the animal's playing. Is mix and match these various motor patterns in a non-functional way. You say the animal's playing. And And the answer to that is it fun? Well, I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. Yeah, it's probably fun. It's probably pleasurable in the sense that Simon talks about, in the sense that when you practice a motor pattern, when you display a motor pattern, you get a sense of pleasure out of it. You actually have a opiate release, an endorphin. You runners all know, you go on a runner's high, and you get a shot of endorphins, which feels pleasurable. But when it's a non-functional, when you're putting those motor patterns together and getting those little pleasures from performing the motor pattern, but the result is not functional in the sense that it doesn't get you calories, it doesn't get your genes in the next generation, it doesn't go anything. And so that's play.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah. So kind of to follow up to that, you mentioned the good stuff in play, but sometimes in an applied setting in people's homes, they see that play can turn into conflict. And so somebody pointed out that they noticed that why do play vocalizations escalate into conflict? And so anybody want to speak to that idea, that it's not always happy, happy, happy forever?
Can I give it a shot?
Kathryn, Kathryn, yeah.
Sure. So there's a little difference between neonatal play, or the juvenile play, and the adult play, in that the juvenile play is this actual development occurring. In adults, it's less clear exactly what's happening, but it may be ritualization. If you look at adult dog play, it's a lot less random than young dogs playing, and they're interacting with new individuals, and so a lot of times you have that random interaction and nobody's quite sure what's going to happen next, and so there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you certainly get barking. And it's possible somebody could do something which might be construed as more dangerous than playful, and as soon as you have a miscommunication there, things go downhill. So if you have a poorly socialized dog, it's way more possible that dog won't understand the social interaction and will do something inappropriate and get bit, and the whole thing goes downhill. So it's a very tenuous thing as an adult. It's a little unclear what's going on in the adults.
One of the themes that, sorry, Trisha, I'll let you come in. I'll just mention as a comment to add to the conversation, one of the comments that came up repetitively during the afternoon session in regards to different people's research was talking about the effect of owners or handlers in proximity to dogs. So whether it's in regards to play and vocalization, whether it's in regards to strange situation responses, and the effect of the owner and handler. So perhaps if while we're discussing, we can also just be mindful of that factor and talk about that.
Sure, so how the owner being nearby might affect vocalization?
And play, yeah.
Okay, sure. So for vocalization, certainly so for barking, we're talking about an internal state and being conflicted. Someone familiar being nearby could certainly change that. So you may be more or less conflicted depending on the situation. As far as other vocalizations, they have different functions in different contexts. So if they were associated with someone familiar being nearby, certainly that could change. So it really varies between vocalizations. Sorry to be so vague. But
no, that's fine. I will let Trisha say what I interrupted just before.
Oh, no, that's okay. And gosh, what was it? Oh, yeah, it was about, just going backwards just a tiny bit. It was about why does play sometimes turn into aggression? And I guess my take on that is that it's partly about arousal. Is that part of what's fun about play is that you throw away some of your inhibitions, and you can start to get more and more aroused with fewer and fewer inhibitions. I don't know if they use it where anybody is living right now or where you're from, but there's a saying where I'm from in Wisconsin, which is I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out. And it's because we all know it's very, very common. I mean, the World Cup is going on right now, and people have died in soccer matches because the spectators got so aroused and so excited, and so one of the things
only the English.
What? Only the English? Have you been to South America? You have, I know. So one of the things from an applied sense and an owner sense that I think is really critical is understanding that healthy play in dogs includes a lot of pauses. Karen London and I, another certified applied behaviorist, have speculated that even play bows during play are one of the mechanisms that dogs have to create sort of a pause and a timeout to manage arousal levels. And that's something that human primates don't tend to do, and especially children. And I speculate, guess, just from experience, it seems as though a lot of the problems related to dog-dog aggression are from owners often not understanding about a need for a dog to manage its arousal levels and therefore keep hyping a dog up, especially kids, until it sort of falls over to aggression. I would love to hear Simone talk about I don't know if you want to, but I'm fascinated if anybody knows about the neurophysiology of play and arousal. I'd love to learn more about it. I don't know if anybody knows.
Well, yeah, there's a little bit of research on this, especially with rats, one of the favorite models of neuroscience. But yeah, there's actually we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but there's a little bit of a precarious balance between two systems here at play. And when you engage in play fighting, especially, that's where it gets really, really dangerous, because you're right on the cusp of falling into the other category. So if there's a bad communication between two individuals, or bite that was a little bit unexpected, then suddenly it's that other part of the brain that gets activated and it's not play anymore. So that's how you say rough and tumble play, falling into full-blown kind of aggression. Has a little bit to do with endorphins, but it's unclear that they can change that quickly in the brain to explain, everything that occurs in a cascade like this when things start escalating. But unfortunately, the problem with play in social context, from a neuroscience perspective anyway, it's really hard to study, because you need an animal that is literally connected to a system that would allow you to know what's going on. And most of what we can do now with neuroimaging requires the animal to be mobile. And from the neurochemistry side of things, you can't really do it with live animals without being quite invasive. So some people would love to do this with dogs, but probably will never happen, and that's a good thing.
Could I just say one more thing really fast? So it was interesting you bring in the play bow, because and to wrap it back up with the consciousness, there's an alternative hypothesis for the play bow, that it's actually conflict behavior. So getting in that position where your front end's low and your back end's high allows you to both quickly retreat and quickly run forward. And you actually see it a lot. Ray's got some great pictures from Wolf Park of wolves doing that to bison. When they get right in this sort of danger zone, they play bow, and they can either run away if the bison starts charging them or chase them if they go the other way. So it would be a sort of a less conscious choice and more of a, where's this going from here sort of moment.
But
Monique?
So I think there was another great example, actually, in Patricia, in one of your videos, is that sometimes one of the dogs may be communicating that they're done or they are done, and the other dog is not done playing. And so not only is there a disjunctive communication, but there may be, a disjunct in the amount of time that they want to engage in that behavior. And then in terms of the human addition, I often see people holding their dogs in place or pushing their dogs back into play after they've clearly tried to get out of it. And that usually ends up resulting in something not desirable between those dogs.
just very quickly, one thing that's interesting here is we've had reports of this actually studying coyotes, that often young coyotes will approach humans with the play bow. And it looks like they engage in a full play sequence, but we know that that may or may not be where it ends. But and I think all it is, it's a posture, right? And the context will tell you what may or may not happen, plus a bunch of other factors that you know nothing about in terms of the history of that animal, its physiology, its motivational status, all these kinds of things. So I think when they do this, it's often just to test. They try to figure out how that buffalo or that human or that other coyote, whatever, will react, essentially. It's a test. And sometimes they will say, okay, well, if the playful approach doesn't work, then they'll try something else. And that may be a little bit more aggressive. So.
Can I add one more thing? This is so exciting. It's so fun. No, it's two. I lied. Actually, one is, this is a PhD waiting to happen. Hello, everybody, and all these wonderful people you can associate with and do a PhD on. Yes, there's been work on play bows, but we need a lot more, obviously, right? But there's just an observation that I had years ago when I was, when I had breeding border collies, and one of the things I noticed was that when I always kept the puppies with a female, I never weaned them, and what I noticed was when the bitches were weaning the puppies themselves, the way they would do it, they would get into a play bow position. So the puppy would come around to try and nurse, and the female would turn and face and play bow, keeping access away from the milk. And I was like, I actually went up to Beckoff once and I said, could that be the derivation of the play bow? And he snorted and dismissed it instantly. I was crushed. But it's just an interesting posture that could relate to conflict, could relate to simply keeping your puppies away, or could relate to teaching a puppy how to play. So many things.
Bringing it back again to, I guess, conflict and aggression, one of the questions that we received through Twitter from Anne was asking specifically about dog daycare studies and whether there's any evidence that staff unknowingly correcting normal play causes conflict for dogs. And I thought we could broaden that out a little bit more and talk about just humans unintentionally causing conflict for dogs and some of the main areas that you see we may be doing that we can perhaps become more aware of in our daily dealings with dogs.
So one example, and it sort of could potentially go back to the play example, but sometimes when dogs appear in conflict, their owners try to interrupt when they're just about to work it out. So one of the dogs may be about to submit or may be backing off. Their owner runs in and grabs them by the collar and traps them. And then they start exhibiting this conflict or possibly even aggressive behavior. So that's one thing potentially to watch out for. Sometimes we think we're doing the dog a favor by protecting it. In some cases, it may have been in less trouble if we just let it finish what it was doing.
Just a little criticism of my colleagues, all of you, is that you talk about aggression as if it's a bad thing. All right, and the fact is that what I said in my talk this morning is that, there has been natural selection that has gone in and supported certain kinds of aggressions in order to protect mates or foraging or whatever else. And it's probable that the animal in an aggressive posture is getting just as much pleasure as if he was, in some other happy reproductive mode or eating a moose or whatever else. It may be just as pleasurable to him to be aggressive as it is. I know it is for me.
So to bounce off that, because and maybe somebody would want to jump in with just reasons for relinquishment and challenges that companion dogs face when they are displaying what owners might call undesirable aggression. So maybe there are some benefits for the dogs themselves, but in the context in which they've found themselves, it's not always beneficial. So anybody want to comment on research in that area? Excellent. Well, I'm sure that's
I can
because
mention one quick thing that
we're all in agreement. Yeah.
well, some people are unaware of what Ray just said, that aggression is a natural behavior, and seeing any type of aggression panics some people and causes them to relinquish their pet because the dog growled at the child. Well, that was actually a really good thing because it's letting the child know that that was not acceptable and they would rather them not be in that situation. So they were actually avoiding a bite by communicating this information. And so some things we consider aggressive are actually adaptive in the home too.
Wonderful point.
There's also this sort of stupid tendency among people to, if a dog is aggressive, they think they have to assert themselves and suppress this behavior. And that inevitably leads to an escalation with some dogs. And it's just so stupid, it doesn't, at some level they don't understand the dog at all. Because if you back off from that dog, if you relieve the dog of the social pressure, the chances are it won't do it again. It's just done it that once. But as soon as you escalate, then you're setting things up for trouble.
And I'm sure this will come up a lot on the third day.
And there are many trainers who are encouraging people to do that,
Yes.
which is unbelievable.
So science and training, day number 3. Remember to come back. We'll have the oxytocin spray for the noses also, just in case.
And tomorrow when we're discussing personality and temperament, perhaps we can talk about how oxytocin will affect you individually. Yes. Well, we're actually, unfortunately, out of time for the panel already, so would you join us all in thanking our speakers from the panel discussion? Okay, we've just got some, I guess, basic key summary points we'd just like to revisit before we finish the broadcast for today. We heard a lot from all our different speakers today on topics regarding social hierarchy, aggression and conflict. We've learnt that they're complex, multifaceted areas of social animal behaviour, and that certainly, for the most part, the influence of dog breed is small.
We've also seen that aggression and conflict can have a functional, evolutionary role and purpose in the lives of canids. So keeping that in mind, that there's a function of it, it's not just something that we want to squash.
And also that, I guess, the understanding of social systems of other animals can improve our understanding of dog behaviour, but we also need to be mindful that the dogs we have in our homes are not wild canids like wolves.
So that's what we have for today. So please join us in thanking all of our wonderful speakers, and we'll see you all tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. we start, so maybe come a little early, okay?
And that's US Eastern Time for
US
everyone
Eastern
joining
Time.
in around the world.
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Julie and Mia. Julie and